Good day and welcome to the COVID-19 podcast. This is the podcast where we talk anything and everything COVID-19, as well as debunk myths related to the pandemic. Now, today I am joined by the also intelligent Christie Keulder, a researcher at the Survey Warehouse. Now, Christie, I call you intelligent because I feel like I learn new terms, new things every time I read your articles, right? So sorry, by the way. Thanks for joining me, Christie.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Now, like I said, I keep on learning new things from your articles, right? And I guess in general, we all are learning new things about the virus every day. We all are learning new things about the vaccines every day. But it's not to say that these things have not been there before. I guess it's just because we are in constant sort of proximity to knowledge about the virus, that we are, learning new things about viruses and vaccines in general. Now, in your article titled The Movable Middle, obviously you speak about the movable middle. I just want to find out, because this is a new term to me, is this a new terminology, or has this been there before? But most importantly, what does it actually mean?
Yes. Yeah, I think, generally what's happening is that there's a lot more attention on perhaps scholarly jargon, scholarly concepts that otherwise we would not have had access to. These things have become part of our daily lives because we're talking about some public health issue. And the more we learn about this issue, the more we are introduced to the jargon and the concepts and the approaches of different scientific principles
Exactly.
sort of scientific disciplines that we sort of, this jargon is now becoming part of our normal world.
Yeah, and we used to bypass that before.
Yeah, we didn't have to talk about a movable middle
Precisely.
before, for example, or vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah.
These are problems that and occurrences and events and phenomena that we now have to address in our quest to find a way out of this pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So the movable middle is a concept that is used in vaccine literature, and it's a concept that refers to the people in a society that are unsure whether they should or should not get vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
So they haven't made up their mind, which means that they can still be moved to either side, I suppose. But in this case, we would like them to move towards the vaccine side.
Of course.
So that's why they're in the middle. On the far end of the scale, you have vaccine refusers who says, I will not get vaccinated. Come hell or high water, I will not do it. And on the other end, you have the acceptors, people who are embracing vaccines and says, it's not a problem, I'll go. So this cluster is in the middle of these two extreme groups. And they're undecided. We don't know whether they're going to go the anti-vax route or whether they're going to go the pro-vax route. So we're trying to move them. And very important because they are the single biggest cluster in any society. Without them going on to getting vaccinated, there will not be herd immunity through vaccination. So they become a really important part to focus the attention of vaccine campaigns and say, let me help you make up your mind. You have to get vaccinated. So that, in short, is basically what the movable middle is. It's a cluster of people who are uncertain on whether they should or should not be vaccinated.
So what you're essentially saying is that it's more important to focus on the movable middle, just in terms of, reaching a certain vaccine percentage and by virtue of that receiving herd immunity, than to focus on those who refuse to get vaccinated.
Yes, it's often a waste of resources to focus on them. And if you look at the numbers, right, 32% in Namibia says we refuse to get vaccinated, or the chances are highly unlikely that we'll get vaccinated.
Right.
So the ones that embrace vaccines are 24%, which is a small number. It's too small to resemble herd immunity. So we have to get the movable middle to move towards the vaccine side. There's a number of possible thresholds for herd immunity.
Yeah.
Some is as high as 60, 70% of a society. So you can just do the numbers. If we subtract 32% from the population as people who will not be vaccinated come hell or high water, then we need almost all those in the movable middle in order for us to achieve herd immunity. And when we launch these campaigns, resources are limited. We need to focus where we can get best results. And what we're trying to do in this column is to pinpoint this movable middle and says, these are the people you need to focus on in order for them to move over to the vaccination side.
Now, I've read in your article that we sort of can't put a face to who the movable middle is. We can't really tell who they are. But there's another part of your article that says that these people in the movable middle have been less affected by both the health and economic impact of the pandemic thus far. By virtue of, that fact, can't we sort of put a face, or at the very least a group, to resemble or sort of characterize the movable middle?
Look, if they represent 44% of the population, it's unlikely that they'll come from a single group. It's also unlikely that they will be a genetic or a monolithical group.
Yeah.
There are important differences between them. So what we're saying is that if we look at just simply who are the refusers, and we can see that amongst refusers, women are the majority, 54%. Men are more likely to accept the vaccines, 58%, right? But there's no gender gap for the movable middle.
But sorry, Christie, just before we move on, I'm so sorry, just before we move on, Christie, why do you think there is a gender gap between the groups that, refuse to get vaccine and those that are vaccine acceptors, so to say? Why is it so, why is the gender gap so prominent there?
Well, again, we don't have exact reasons for this, but one can speculate. There's been a lot of false information being, sort of surfacing. One of these sort of pieces of information is that the vaccines make women infertile. And this may be a response to that, that women don't want to lose their fertility. There are also issues around, if you remember the debate around the blood clotting, it was mainly young women that were picked up with the AstraZeneca blood clotting issue. Yeah. And although the instances have been very low, there's been a lot of information around that circulating.
Right.
So it's possible that people are responding to these messages. We don't have the exact reasons for it, but I think it is rather interesting.
No, it's extremely interesting.
We would have this. Yeah, that we would have this. And also, if people think, right, that the vaccines are unsafe, maybe it's a case that women as the caretakers, or the traditional caretakers, are scared that the vaccine will make them sick and that they will no longer be able to look after their children or look after their families.
Sure.
But I'm speculating. I don't have, these are all probably part of something into that.
Yeah, that's a safe speculation to make nonetheless.
Yeah. We know that the majority of the movable middle live in urban areas, where people are generally more exposed to messages, where people have better access to media, where people have better access to information. There's also the trend that the majority, 69%, are between 18 and 35-year-olds. So it's younger people. And this may also be because younger people think, they're strong, they'll survive, they don't need the vaccine, the illness will not have such a bad effect on them. But it's also that that age group is particularly highly exposed to modern media,
right?
Social media platforms. And we know from studies that, for example, are now coming out of the US, that at the moment, within Facebook, I think, is the platform they used to collect the data. The movable middle is moving towards the anti-vaccine side. At the moment in our society, more people are pro-vaccines than anti-vaccines. So, but we need to fight for that majority. We need to sort of keep growing the pro-vaccine side. So there are all kinds of possible reasons. We haven't done any study on looking at the impact of social media. But that certainly there are international studies that, for example, also shows that anti-vaccination attitudes strongly correlate with a belief in populist government.
Yeah.
So that sort of explains the kinds of approaches President Trump, for example, had in discrediting the scientists, in discrediting the media, discrediting the institutions. So that kind of situation. And of course, with social media, everybody's aware of those kinds of debates. He said, let's try hydroperoxides and all kinds of other alternative medicines. And the point is, he did try and discredit vaccines. Now, that message could have spread and reached here for some people at least.
So I just really want to touch on something that I found quite interesting, right? Just in terms of, achieving herd immunity. I mean, we're now obviously made aware that the movable middle is still sort of undecided. But also, I remember when the pandemic hit the world, obviously many countries, imposed sort of harsh lockdowns, and there were some countries that didn't impose as such harsh lockdowns as other countries. And by virtue of that, there was talks of there were talks going around that Sweden, was going to achieve herd immunity because they were also one of the countries that didn't sort of impose a hard lockdown. And people were saying they're going to achieve herd immunity because people are going to get the virus. And I'm not saying this with any good conscience at all, but obviously by virtue of that, people were going to die and some people were going to recover. Now, those that were going to recover obviously would have developed the antibodies, and together with those in that position, they were going to achieve herd immunity. Obviously now the virus, the vaccine is around, right? So that's the easier route to take to achieve herd immunity. But are there sort of any other ways we can achieve herd immunity? For instance, what people were saying in Sweden, that everyone should just get the virus, and by virtue of that, some people receive obtain antibodies, and some people unfortunately perish, as we see with the status quo.
Yeah, I don't think the argument was as simple as the way you've put it. I think in Sweden there was, and this was in the beginning of the pandemic when people were sort of debating mainly the economic impact of this pandemic. People weren't dying in the great numbers that we see now.
Yeah.
The Strand was the first variety. So Sweden's argument was that we will trust our citizens to do what is necessary to fight the pandemic.
Right.
We don't have to rely on extreme measures, harsh legislation or regulations in order to tell them what to do. Swedish people will do what the government asks them to do. And there's been this big debate, and the debate has primarily been around, has that worked for the economy? Because people were getting very worried about the economic impact of it.
Of course.
I don't think that debate is around anymore. I think people have realized that the natural way of achieving herd immunity is simply too expensive, economically, but also in terms of
human collateral
on the health system and the loss of human life. Yes. So, and this is something I think which is sort of interesting if we look at our data that I think you've referred to it previously. We wanted to find out whether personal experience with corona or COVID-19 illness has had any impact on how people feel about vaccinations.
Yeah.
Right. So this data, I have to stress, was collected during December, January, and February. So that was during the second wave, of course, which was significantly higher than the first wave. but it wasn't close to the third wave.
Of course not.
So by the time we collected this data, the impact of this pandemic had still been an economic impact rather than a health impact. We were beginning to see the impact on the health system, and we were beginning to see higher levels of deaths, but nowhere near the scale to which we would see it during the third wave.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing, for example, is that people in the movable middle generally hadn't had the same experience in terms of the economic impact. In other words, the economic impact for us is if somebody had lost a job temporarily or permanently, or has lost a big chunk of their income.
Yeah.
So that's an economic cost, right? And we see, for example, that those who accept the vaccines have a higher level of economic cost or personal experience with the pandemic than those in the middle, right?
Right.
So that's one thing. The second thing is we're talking about personal experience with the health impact of COVID. And this could be getting tested positive for COVID, falling sick with COVID. Not just the self, but also people in the household. So that's our personal experience.
Yeah.
People having to go to hospital or moving, dying and so on. So when we look at that, we see that here, the movable middle also has the least experience. Now, from this, one would then sort of ask the question, now what would have happened during the third wave with the movable middle?
Yeah.
Because we've seen that the economic costs remain high and may even increase over time. But the health cost has shot up during the third wave.
Yeah.
More people died, more people got sick, more people got into hospital, more people needed oxygen. So would that convince people to get vaccinated or not? So, and I think that's the interesting component of this so far, that personal experience may be a powerful way to change people's minds when they're uncertain about vaccinations. And hopefully it moves people into the vaccination cluster, which is, of course, the logical thing. But then the question is, isn't it this a very expensive way to get people to change their minds? Maybe we should find a cheaper way. Yeah. Right?
No, wonderfully said, Christie, and very informative as well. I'm actually quite shocked to find out that we have run out of time. But this was, as always, a very interesting conversation. And there you have it, guys, the movable middle. Now, this COVID-19 podcast was brought to you by the Namibian newspaper. We can, of course, always continue the conversation on our social media platforms. And thank you so much again, Christie, for joining me.
It's my pleasure. I hope you have a wonderful Friday and a beautiful weekend.
Thank you, Christie. Same to you as well. And same to everyone else as well. Keep on being safe, wearing your masks, and always social distance and sanitize. From me, John-Colin Namene, it's cheers.